Refined oil supports the Russian war machine in more ways than one. Russia's troops need diesel and gasoline directly to maintain their mechanized assaults against Ukraine's defenses, which are increasingly limited. Russia uses refined oil indirectly to build up its war chest through exports and to appease its people by making sure they have the gasoline necessary for their daily routines. However, all of this is collapsing for Russia. The refined oil lifeline is failing, and Russia is powerless to stop it. Vladimir Putin faced a month from hell in September as Ukraine and Europe together ripped out the oily, beating heart of Russia, causing a state of panic in the country. One number will wound Putin more than any other: 1 million. That is how many tons of gasoline Russia lost in September alone due to a combination of Ukraine's drone strikes and Europe's increasingly tough measures. Strikes and sanctions are converging, Euromaidan Press reported on October 7th. The combination of Ukraine's non-stop drone strikes and clever European Union (EU) policy moves has forced Russia into a catch-22 situation. Will Russia accept domestic shortages? If it does, the impact of the Ukraine war will be felt as far away as Moscow, meaning Putin will start to face pressure from his people. Perhaps Russia can try even riskier sanction evasion attempts. If it does, it will face a problem as the EU is closing in on the shadow fleet. Putin now finds himself tumbling toward a no-win scenario, and the process is already underway. Consider fuel shortages, for instance. Losing 1 million tons of fuel in a single month must hurt somewhere, and massive fuel shortages in many of Russia's most critical regions appear to be the result. Crimea, which Russia occupied in 2014 and is symbolic of everything Putin hopes to achieve with his invasion of Ukraine, is among the most severely affected. Initial signs of an emerging Crimean fuel crisis surfaced on September 25th, when the Kyiv Independent reported that amid shortages, up to half of Crimea's gas stations had already stopped selling fuel. This isn't propaganda from a pro-Ukrainian news outlet. The Kyiv Independent states that the news of the shutdowns comes from Kommersant, a media outlet that is about as pro-Russian as you can find. The outlet monitored 17,000 gas stations across Russia, concluding that shortages were happening all over the country. Crimea, and the southern federal district where Russia claims occupied Crimea belongs, is suffering the most. More than 220 of that district's gasoline stations, which amounts to 14.2% of the district's total, have been forced to suspend fuel sales until Russia's gasoline crisis subsides. Crimea, separated from the Russian mainland and only reachable via water or the Crimean Bridge, is taking the full force of the problem. And it makes sense. Fuel has a long journey before it reaches Crimea, with many stops along the way that will siphon off incoming gasoline supplies. By the time Russia's boats or trains arrive at the occupied peninsula, there's nothing left for Crimea's gas stations to sell. Reuters followed up on these reports with its own article on September 29th. By the end of September, Reuters says, Crimean authorities had frozen fuel prices to stop opportunistic gas station owners from capitalizing on the supply and demand economics, hurting the peninsula to fill their own pockets. Gasoline rationing has also been put in place, limiting customers to buying no more than 30 liters of fuel at a time. This translates to roughly 6.5 gallons. For context, depending on the model, that's about a fifth or a sixth of what a Ford F-150's gas tank holds. One of America's most popular vehicles would be severely hampered if driven in Crimea. A few days after Reuters, Pravda confirmed the Crimean fuel restrictions, adding that some areas of the peninsula are even more strict. They've dropped to 20 liters per customer, with the restrictions impacting 4 types of gasoline: AI-92, AI-95, AI-95NP, and AI-100. Crimea may be the worst hit regarding rationing and shortages. However, Putin is being forced to realize that Crimea is likely just the beginning. Fuel shortages are occurring in other Russian regions, and they will only intensify as the EU and Ukraine continue their joint campaign to dismantle Russia's refining capacity. We'll get to what they're doing later in the video. First, let's look at the broader consequence. The 1 million tons lost in September may be the headline, but it's not the only statistic that matters regarding Russia's growing oil refining crisis. Euromaidan Press adds that Ukraine's series of refinery strikes since August have been so effective that they have managed to take around 40% of Russia's refining capacity offline. Major refineries, such as those in Ryazan and Kiev, have been hit by repeated strikes with no sign of stopping. Any repairs Russia attempts are undone days later when another drone takes out a key component of a targeted oil refinery. These impressive results need to be tempered somewhat by a reality check, and the Carnegie Endowment provided that check in an October 3rd examination of Russia's refining situation. Having said that, the Carnegie Endowment makes some interesting points. Russia's on-paper refining capacity is not its actual capacity in practice. About 22% of Russia's refineries are already idle, which is why the country produces 270 million tons of refined products annually, rather than its maximum of 327 million tons. Ukraine has been hitting the active refineries, meaning it is taking bites out of the other 78% of Russia's refining capacity. The endowment also notes that Russia has surpluses of diesel and gas. The country produces 16% more gasoline than it needs for domestic consumption each year, along with almost 32% more diesel. Russia also has a large supply of naphtha, which can be turned into Euro 3 gasoline using additives. Keep that in mind because we'll return to the use of additives shortly. Ultimately, the Carnegie Endowment says the 40% to 38% figure might be slightly optimistic. Russia is currently refining around 5 million barrels per day. The number would be closer to 4 million if 38% of Russian refining were offline. This moderates the numbers we've seen so far. However, the endowment also concludes by noting that this is still not good news for Russia. Russia's oil refineries are a bit like a man who is being repeatedly punched. He will not die from one punch or even half a dozen punches, but it becomes harder and harder for him to recover after each subsequent blow. Although no single punch is fatal, he could end up being beaten to death. Ukraine understands this. That's why it's repeating its refinery strikes instead of trying for the one-punch knockout. Each drone that lands chips away at a refining industry that is teetering on the edge of a crisis. Nevertheless, the shortages are very real, and they are occurring because Russian stockpiles are not traditionally used to support the domestic market. The 16% of excess gasoline and 32% of excess diesel Russia produces do not remain in Russia. It is sold. Alternatively, it is sent to the front lines in Ukraine to keep Russia's war machine moving. To fix the domestic issue, Putin must sacrifice one or even both of these two other users of Russia's refined oil products. That places Russia's leader right back in the catch-22 situation we outlined earlier in the video. From the outside, it certainly doesn't look like Russia has diesel and gasoline stockpiles large enough to overcome the situation the EU and Ukraine have created. On October 1st, Euromaidan Press reported that Russia will need 9 months to manage its fuel crisis, which is not the timeline you would expect from a supposed energy superpower. That would place Russia in mid-2026 before its fuel situation is under control. That also likely assumes that Ukraine halts its refinery strikes and the EU implements no more sanctions. Hint, that won't happen. Still, as Russia attempts to wait out the 9 months, it is taking several increasingly desperate measures to both hide and solve its fuel crisis from its domestic consumers. Leaning on Belarus is one of Russia's tricks. Reuters reported on October 7th that Belarus's rail-transported gasoline exports to Russia quadrupled in September, reaching 49,000 tons. Diesel saw a similar spike in exports, hitting 33,000 tons. This could only be happening because Russia is attempting to tackle the fuel shortage we've already discussed. However, relying on Belarus, even if Putin sees that nation as a puppet state, won't work for very long. The country doesn't produce enough gasoline to supply its own people and Russia, as you'll learn if you check out our video on why Russia's reliance on Belarus for refined oil is a sign of Putin's growing desperation. With Belarus only able to offer a temporary solution, Russia has turned to other measures to deal with its gasoline crisis, the Moscow Times reports. On October 1st, it announced that Russia plans to scrap its gasoline import tariffs. It will also get rid of an additive ban, which links back to the potential use of naphtha we mentioned earlier. Combined, these two measures could divert about 350,000 tons of gasoline back into Russia's domestic market per month. That's not quite enough to cover the 1 million tons Russia lost in September, but it might at least shorten the queues at the gasoline stations. Russia will also pump about 100,000 tons of diesel per month into the domestic market, assuming these measures are enacted. The approach might not be as effective as Russia hopes, the Moscow Times adds. The outlet says the high cost of transport could eliminate any benefit Russian citizens might enjoy from having access to duty-free fuel. Additionally, the proposal to permit the limited use of ethanol in gasoline production, along with loosening standards to allow higher shares of aromatic hydrocarbons, is another sign of Russia's desperation. Strict technical standards and bans on additives are in place for a reason. The Kremlin's willingness to discard them means it is more concerned with making it look like there is no gasoline crisis in Russia than it is with the well-being of Russia's people. And if all else fails, the Kremlin can simply do what it always does: lie to its people. A September 30th, Moscow Times report suggests those lies have already begun. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's mouthpiece, is already making the rounds to claim that Russian people are completely united around President Putin, to the point where they are willing to bear any burdens caused by Putin's decisions. But what burdens? In almost the same breath, Peskov also claims that Russia is balanced, predictable, and stable. So why is he saying that Russians are willing to sacrifice when they apparently don't need to worry about sacrificing anything? As for the gasoline shortages, no one needs to worry about those either. The Moscow Times says the Kremlin's propagandists are on the case. Shortages are being caused by scheduled oil refinery maintenance, which makes no sense. The Kremlin appears to want its people to believe that its own incompetence is to blame, rather than Europe's sanctions or Ukraine's strikes. Russian state media will only concede that several objective factors are at play, without telling Russia's people that refineries are burning. Putin's month from hell won't be solved by these kinds of tactics. Belarus can't help for long. Lies may work temporarily, but they will eventually collapse as the gasoline shortages worsen and spread further across Russia. Even lifting restrictions on how gasoline is manufactured won't be enough. How did Russia even get to this point? There are two factors at play, both of which we have mentioned several times already: Ukraine's long-range drone strikes and European sanctions. They form a potent combination that has the Kremlin on the verge of crumbling. We've already discussed the impact of Ukraine's drone strikes, but we haven't covered what has made these strikes so effective in August and now September. It all comes down to a change in Ukraine's approach. As the BBC points out, Ukraine has been hitting Russian oil refineries since January 2024. That month saw 3 strikes, as did February. The 2024 strikes peaked in May, with 7 refineries being hit before tapering off for the rest of 2024. Though somewhat effective, these 2024 strikes, along with those Ukraine conducted in early 2025, had the same problem. Ukraine would hit a refinery and then move on. That gave Russia a chance to perform repairs, meaning the struck refinery was never offline for too long. By August 2025, Ukraine had adapted its strategy. Now, the first strike on a refinery is not the only one Ukraine carries out. Ukraine strikes, waits a few days, and then strikes again, and again. The goal is to keep the refinery offline no matter what Russia attempts to do to repair it. In August, Ukraine used this tweaked strategy to target 14 of Russia's refineries. September saw it repeatedly hit 8 refineries. Between January 2024 and September 2025, Ukraine has hit 21 of Russia's 38 large oil refineries. Ukraine's attacks are constant. They're also successful. Ukraine is also not restricting itself to refinery strikes. As The Economist pointed out in an October 5th article, where it dramatically claimed that Ukraine's hellfire is intensifying, other Russian energy infrastructure is also in the Ukrainian crosshairs. Oil pumping stations and oil storage units are also being hit, with a mid-September attack on the massive oil loading port of Primorsk standing out. So, Ukraine is not just striking Russia's refineries. It's trying to eliminate Russia's means of transporting its oil. both within the country and to its external customers. Ukraine is employing a winning strategy here, and the country knows it. October has already seen several more strikes. On October 6th, Ukrainian drones attacked the largest oil terminal in Crimea, which will only add to the woes that the occupied peninsula's citizens are already enduring. And mere hours before we created the script for this video, Ukraine's drones also attacked a Russian refinery in the Siberian region of Tyumen. The Moscow Times says this might represent Ukraine's farthest strike yet, as its drones had to travel over 200 miles. Russia claims it shot down all 3 drones. But the actual outcome hasn't been confirmed by either side yet. As Ukraine pounds away at Russia's refineries, the EU has been getting more active in implementing specific measures that also harm Russia's refining capacity. Sanctions have played a significant role in keeping the refineries that Ukraine strikes offline because they limit Russia's access to the parts it needs to carry out repairs. The new voice of Ukraine was making this point back in July, quoting the Russian Energy Minister Sergei Tsivilyov. Why are there sometimes disruptions? Because now, under the sanctions regime we're in, let's say 4 months are planned for repairs, but something was delayed, something was not delivered, Tsivilyov said. Reuters adds to this, noting that each Ukrainian attack takes weeks, or sometimes longer, to repair, because Russia's engineers simply don't have access to the parts they need to do the work. All the EU needs to do now is build on the good work it's already doing. A 19th round of sanctions is incoming that will sting Putin even more. Euromaidan Press says that this package is specifically designed to curb Russia's oil revenues, likely via sanctions being placed on yet more of Putin's shadow fleet. The EU is also likely to accelerate its own ban on liquefied natural gas purchases from Russia, with the ban to be implemented by 2027. Plus, the EU has lowered the price cap on Russian oil to about $48 per barrel. Add all of this to more sanctions placed on the technological supply chains Russia needs to keep open to support its refineries, and you have a powerful 1-2 punch from the EU and Ukraine. Ukraine shuts them down. The EU's sanctions keep them shut down. The only obstacle to the EU's sanctions may be those few members within the bloc that are a little too pro-Russian for the rest of Europe's comfort. Some of the EU's members slow the implementation of sanctions packages, often forcing the softening of measures and rewrites before allowing the packages to pass. Hungary, in particular, has a history of using its veto power to stop EU sanctions in their tracks. That may end soon. As Politico reported in August, several European leaders have come up with the idea of making sanctions decisions at the national level, rather than requiring a full EU consensus. That would stop the vetoes, though it also creates opportunities for nations within the EU to not follow through on proposed sanctions. Still, sanctions from most, though not all, EU members are still better than no sanctions. There's more. Adding to the already powerful combination of EU sanctions and Ukrainian drone strikes, several European nations are now taking a much more active approach to dealing with Russia's shadow fleet vessels. The knock-on effects when it comes to Russia's domestic fuel crisis are not immediately obvious. However, they are there if you look closely enough. More shadow fleet vessels being stopped means less oil being sold by Russia. When Russia sells less oil, it makes less money, which also means it cannot pay for as many of the components and parts it can still access to conduct refinery repairs. Russia may also be using its shadow fleet to purchase these parts from third-party nations that first buy from the countries that have sanctioned Russia. So, cutting the flow in that respect also helps to limit Russian refining, which only builds on Putin's month from hell. France has garnered a lot of headlines in this regard. In early October, French officials boarded a suspected shadow fleet vessel, taking the ship's captain into custody. Putin denounced the affair as an act of piracy. But for France, it sent a message that the nation would no longer tolerate Russia's shady, sanctions-dodging ships in its waters. That ship captain will stand trial in February, The Guardian reports, and it will be interesting to see if other EU nations follow France's lead. Denmark has its own ideas. It has come up with a simple, yet ingenious way of dealing with shadow fleet ships. More scrutiny. The Danes are going to start using their control over several of the Baltic Sea access points to pile even more pressure onto Putin as he tries to recover from his month from hell. Find out how in our video, and remember to subscribe to Warzone Party for more coverage of Russia's refined oil crisis.